All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Nick Loris, Vice President of Public Policy at C3 Solutions. Welcome to Free the Economy, Nick.
Thanks for having me.
So to start with, can you tell us just a little bit about what C3 does and how you ended up working there and doing what you do today? We always like our guests to give a little kind of mini kind of career sketch about how they got where they
Yeah,
are.
sure. I appreciate that. Yeah, so C3 is a nonprofit public policy organization that started in 2020. It stands for the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions, which gives people a little bit of heartache when they first hear that because, conservative and climate has often been synonymous with policies that those in the free market community are not big fans of, like carbon taxes or subsidies. And we agree that carbon taxes and subsidies are ineffective climate policies. The way we approach this is through free markets. And kind of our bumper sticker message is that free economies are clean economies. And the policies that are rooted in economic freedom, regulatory efficiency, lower taxes, innovation, private property rights, and a rule of law, and open markets with freer trade all lead to not only more prosperous societies, but they also help reduce unwanted emissions, whether that's criterion pollution or greenhouse gas emissions. And so I got my start actually as a Koch fellow back in '07, '08. I did the Koch Associate Program, and through that program was placed at the Heritage Foundation, fell into energy and environment policy, and worked there for about a dozen years, and made the move over to C3 in 2021.
All right, fantastic. Now, so one of the biggest topics, today in economics and industrial policy and certainly the question of future abundance and economic growth is the role nuclear energy is going to play going forward. And so that interacts with both our sort of traditional planning for energy production and also climate politics and climate policy. So we have a nuclear industry in this country that, was once really successful in the mid 20th century and then kind of stalled out for a long time when not many new plants were built. There wasn't much movement there. But now seems to be like we have a moment here where it's poised to grow again. So I know you've been writing about this recently. Are we poised for a nuclear power renaissance in the US?
I hope so. I really think it still comes down to getting the policy right. I think if you look at nuclear, it's interesting in the fact that usually with kind of some of these big industrial projects, you see economies of scale where the more we build them, the better we get, more efficient, costs come down. And in the United States, that's kind of been the opposite approach. And there's been, a lot of literature that have shown as we built more, we've actually it's become more costly, more time consuming to bring these power plants online because of more stringent regulations that have had kind of diminishing marginal returns from an environmental health and public policy standpoint. Almost to the fact that there were zero public health benefits from some of these regulations. And so it's become increasingly challenging to build nuclear and license plants in the United States. That is hopefully starting to change with a new directive for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but it's been a frustrating process. What I will say is that I think it's exciting the private sector interest in both existing large light water reactor technologies, which is what we have in the United States today, but also the small modular reactor technologies that can be, anywhere from micro reactors, providing a few megawatts to, up to, 350, 400 megawatts or so. And so there's a lot of innovation happening in the front end of the nuclear space. And there seems to be more private sector appetite to purchase that power, understanding that companies have their own emissions targets. They may be net zero, whether you agree with that policy or not, but these companies have made those commitments, and understanding just the load growth and the need for firm dispatchable power that's always on. Nuclear provides a lot of advantages. I think that there's still some concern about the costs of nuclear. But I think that's again where public policy can play a role in helping to drive those costs down, not through subsidies, but reducing those regulatory barriers.
Yeah, I know you so recently had this great short piece with Robert Eccles from Oxford Business School about common misconceptions about nuclear. And so a lot of these are about um the sort of economics of nuclear power in general. Some of them are about, the transition from like the older style plants you mentioned to the possible future of small modular reactors. So, but I'm just going to read a few of these uh, that you highlighted in the piece, and then you can give me the quick kind of short version uh, of the points made. So, there's six ones here. One, nuclear is clean and dependable. That is part of that is like you said, air pollution and climate wise, they're clean, but also sort of dependable, by which I mean, I assume you mean like the dispatchable dependable power.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In terms of the cleanliness, emissions free with the power output, which again, not just from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint, but also there's no criterion pollutants emitted when you are running a nuclear power plant. And yes, there's emissions when you are mining the uranium, building the power plant, and that's true of all energy power sources. There's environmental trade-offs with every choice of energy that we make and produce. But from a life cycle emission standpoint, nuclear is still on par with the cleanest forms of energy sources. Not to mention, it has a very small environmental footprint compared to renewable technologies, for instance. So that makes the prospects for nuclear even more compelling environmentally. And as you mentioned, one of the advantages of nuclear is that it really operates 24/7. That we talk about the capacity factor, the amount that the plant can be operating, and nuclear is consistently above 90%. The only time it's really offline is for maintenance, and then you have the other reactor that's on site running or has other dispatchable power. And so if you compare that to again, intermittent sources of energy that have capacity factors anywhere from 25% to 33%. Nuclear provides a lot of advantages for being a 24/7 dispatchable power.
Yeah, and the the question of, how much of the time is it on and actually producing, um, I think is something that one, I think people who have been thinking about this kind of understand because they know of like wind and solar, for example, are more intermittent. They're not on all the time because the sun's not always shining and the wind is not always blowing, as we say. But even when it comes to statistics, sometimes you will hear that so much new renewable capacity has been installed, or that capacity is growing dramatically, and you see like a line on a chart going up to the side. Um, but often that's the theoretical capacity of
Right.
of the production, which is we know for a fact is not going to be on all the time or even 90% of the time. And so sometimes those numbers get stacked up against traditional older energy sources, and they look a little more optimistic than is really realistic.
For sure. And you can go and look at, just the amount of power that is supplying our electricity grid and see kind of the numbers themselves. And so yeah, you're exactly right. As you see a lot of stories, both in the United States and globally, that, we've added this much wind and solar capacity over X period of time, and it's growing exponentially. And it makes it seem as if wind and solar are now our primary sources of electricity providers, and they're certainly growing by any means. And again, gets into a larger discussion of subsidies and cost competitiveness, which this is a separate conversation than that, and probably needs a whole other podcast. And I know you've covered a lot of those topics already. But in that regard, nuclear provides that capacity factor above 90%. And so, yes, you're not seeing as many plants come online, but the bang for the buck you get from each power plant is tremendously higher.
Right. And so the second of these six main points, nuclear power is safe, right? Uh, a lot of us watched that Chernobyl show on cable. um, the nuclear power we have in this country, and certainly the nuclear power plants that are being designed and built going forward, are not Chernobyl.
Yeah, that's right. And if you look at the major incidents that have happened, we've had the partial meltdown at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, where again, that was the worst incident that happened in the United States, and there was no radiation exposure. There was no deaths or injuries from that partial meltdown. In fact, it was not a flaw of nuclear technology. It was a human error, and in a lot of senses, the partial meltdown worked in the way that it kind of should, ensuring that there wasn't any radiation exposure and there wasn't any public health incidents. And so if the worst incident is that nothing really bad happened, that's an encouraging sign. Again, probably the most recent one that people point to is Fukushima, but I mean that in and of itself, I think it is almost a complement to the technology because it withstood a 9.3 earthquake magnitude earthquake and a tsunami, and still kind of held up in pretty tremendous fashion. There was only one plant worker who died from radiation exposure, and even scientists have contended whether or not that lung cancer that he had was actually because of the radiation exposure. And so, even in that case, it's for the amount of power you get from nuclear power and for the environmental benefits and the always on factors, from an overall public health and safety perspective, it's one of the safest forms, if not the safest form of electricity that we have. In fact, there was a study from, I can't remember, I know it was published in the National Bureau of Economic Research, but it looked at the mortality rates of policies to shut down nuclear power plants, understanding that the decision caused electricity rates to increase. That meant fewer people could afford power in the winter, and mortality rates rose as a consequence. So that this study showed that there were actually higher mortality rates of the public policy decision to shut down nuclear as compared to the actual incident at Fukushima. And just quickly to your last point, I mean, Chernobyl was a reactor technology that just would not be licensed and permitted here in the United States, or really anywhere else in the world today. It was that actually did have some flaws in its design and technology, but again, it's nothing like that can or will be built in the world going forward.
All right. And so, number three of these six, nuclear power plants are not a source of uranium for building bombs. That has certainly been a concern globally that there will be nuclear proliferation and that fissile bomb making materials are getting out in the hands of terrorists and things like that. And the U.S. Military and intelligence community and State Department has a lot of like work to make sure that doesn't happen. Um, but those are two separate issues, right?
They are, yeah, and it's very difficult to take uh, the civilian commercial nuclear power that we get and actually use those use that uranium, use those fuel sources to actually make a bomb. It would it would be difficult to actually get. It would be difficult to transport, and also the quantities and levels of enrichment are totally different, and so um, it's very hard to see how the increase of nuclear power would result in increases of the procurement and making of nuclear weapons. And again, that's not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about that. That should always be a concern. There are hostile actors that may want to get their hands on nuclear weapons, but the causation of increased deployment of nuclear power plants, of which we now have 400 around the world, has not led to any more proliferation risks. In fact, there's some evidence that suggests that because countries have a better understanding of nuclear cooperation as a result of nuclear trade with democratic institutions and countries, that they've worked together to better understand those proliferation risks and work together to ensure that hostile actors aren't getting their hands on these materials. So I think that there's a good case to be made that the commercial deployment and the cooperation that we see to deploy nuclear around the world is actually helping on a proliferation risks side too.
All right, excellent. Next one, nuclear waste is manageable. I know I have heard from a lot of people in the industry who have talked about this very enthusiastically, very colorfully. I was at the American Nuclear Society's annual conference earlier this year, and I saw some photos of a woman who is a scientist. She had taken a snapshot there, and that she had walked out. And she was at a nuclear facility, and they have these big concrete storage casks that are just sitting there on the on the ground. And she walked up and she put her arms around it, was hugging it like she was hugging a tree, and she's like, see, there is no I'm not getting any radiation here, right? There's material that's considered waste that's inside this cask. It's in concrete and it's safe. um but it's fine for me to literally stand right next to. And I've heard some estimates that you could take all the nuclear waste in the country, even with more plants in the future, and you could just stick it all in one football field, right? And that's where it would all just stay, and it would be emitting virtually no radiation whatsoever.
Yeah, that's right. And to your point, I mean, the dry cask storage, the interim storage that we have on site is completely safe, and I think there's a lot of acceptance among the public because they don't even know that it's happening, but it's safely stored on site. And I cited that similar football field study. I think it actually came from like a quick analysis that was made by the Department of Energy saying for the last 60 years, the United States has been producing spent fuel that we could store it all on a football field in a depth of less than 10 yards. And so to your point, like we can handle a lot more. And really the failure to manage spent fuel in the United States is not a failure of private industry or a flaw of nuclear energy in and of itself, but a fundamental flaw and failure of public policy is that we have the Nuclear Waste Policy Act that said that the federal government was going to take title of this waste and they were going to manage it and have oversight of it. And the thinking was that this stuff does last a very long time. We're talking tens of thousands of years, and we know that the government is going to be around in tens of thousands of years. So maybe it makes sense for the government to take hold of it rather than companies which might be out of business. And so that thinking may have made sense at the time, but the actual and unsurprisingly, the management and execution has been not very good. The government has not collected an atom of waste since the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, as amended, passed in '98. And they've looked at geologic repositories, most notably Yucca Mountain in Nevada, and haven't done their fulfilled their statutory obligation, and therefore the nuclear industry sued the federal government for failing to fulfill that statutory obligation. And so now we, as taxpayers, are paying the industry for the government's failure. And there are a number of different examples where the private sector has actively managed a waste. And you mentioned the dry cask storage as an example of the industry, managing that waste successfully and safely. There's also examples of other countries. Finland is a primary example where kind of a consortium of private sector companies came together to say, okay, we do need a geologic repository. We're going to build it in a town that already has nuclear plants. There's a great public acceptance of it. And they have a good private sector solution to long-term management of spent fuel. And so I think if we can inject more private sector solutions into our spent fuel policy, not only will you have more efficient management styles because it's coming from the private sector and better outcomes, but you also see more innovation in the space too. I think it could be dry cask storage, it could be geologic repositories, it could be spent fuel recycling, but we don't really have a market for spent fuel management right now. And the more we can price in those policies accurately and say like this is what it costs for dry cask storage, this is what it costs to put it in an geologic repository, this is what it costs to recycle, you're going to get investments and innovations. And I think that's where you could see a lot of innovation in spent fuel management to actually drive the costs down, because there are some SMR companies that are running on spent fuel, and it provides a really unique opportunity to not only better manage the fuel, but to lower the cost of the management. And absent public policy changes, I fear we're just not going to get there.
Well, yeah, and so this next one here is a good example of how public policy rather than any physical reality is driving this. Number 5 out of 6 here is nuclear can be cost competitive and built without long delays. This is something that a lot of nuclear critics point to, and they like, look, this takes, maybe nuclear has some advantages, but it takes forever and it's way too expensive, and that therefore we need other options. But the response from me, and I assume from you, is that the reason why it's so expensive and takes forever is because of government regulation, not because of some physical constant of the universe.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And even former President Trump brought this up on the Joe Rogan podcast a few days ago, saying and pointing to the Vogtle plant in Georgia. I think he got the numbers wrong, and he underestimated the cost overruns. I think he said it cost 25 billion to build, and it was upwards over 30 billion. And the project ran 7 years behind schedule, and $17 billion over budget. And so, yeah, that's going to make a lot of people say, why are we doing this when wind and solar are cheap and, batteries are getting cheaper and things like that? But again, there's a lot of public policy that artificially inflates the cost and results in time delays to bring these power plants online. And, there's been attempts through legislation, through NEMA in 2019 and through the Advance Act this year to really kind of force the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to do a better job to better understand the public benefits of nuclear power, to create more efficient licensing and permitting processes for advanced reactor technologies, as well as to reduce some of the again, barriers that have inflated the cost of nuclear. For one, that we couldn't have a lot of foreign ownership or investment in nuclear power. And maybe that on the surface sounds good from a national security perspective, but you also have companies like Areva in France that is kind of at the forefront of nuclear power. You have Japanese and Korean technologies and companies that could be investing in the United States, and so that's one barrier. There are barriers when it comes to just what materials can be used to build a plant. And so they all have to be nuclear grade materials, but they're not really any different than the regular materials that we would use for construction, but they cost a lot more. And then there's other regulations. Probably that um, the one that I think is probably the most frustrating is the as low as as low as reasonably achievable standards for radiation, and essentially saying that if you can reduce the radiation from your technology, you have to try to do so, even if it meets public health and safety standards. You still have to do it, and that results in time, money, and a lot of cost for negligible environmental benefits. And so, fixing the licensing and permitting processes is necessary. Fixing some of these back end regulations that increase the cost to build and operate nuclear power plants can all really help drive down the cost of these technologies. And they still may be expensive, but you've seen even just recently with Amazon, saying we're going to put the money behind this technology, will help drive down some of the green premium of these SMR technologies that are newer. And then I think if you really have a NRC that is focused on, the performance of the technology, is technology neutral, it can allow a number of different SMR technologies to flourish, and the ones that are the most innovative and cost competitive and provide the most value to a very heterogeneous customer base are the ones that are going to flourish. And again, the pieces of legislation that have been signed into law have been good steps forward, but in my opinion, doesn't go nearly far enough to fix some of the outstanding policy and regulatory issues that we really need to address that can help bring down the cost of nuclear.
Well, yeah, and so very related to that is the last of these six, which is that nuclear can survive in a world without subsidies. So there's potentially obvious subsidies up front when it comes to construction, subsidizing construction, but also sort of implicit subsidies, which if you let the the budget go over budget and then you allow the operator to pass that on through rate increases, then that's sort of an implicit subsidy, in
Right.
effect. But and there's been for as long as I've been paying attention to energy policy, which has been a while, there have been constant fights between the renewable people, between the fossil fuel people, between the nuclear people, with everyone pointing to each other saying, "You're subsidized. No, you're subsidized. No, you have more subsidies." Um,
Right.
and
You and me both.
is it one making the basic point that nuclear energy can survive in a world without subsidies? But is there also a subsidy détente possible? Like, will the various sides ever agree what policies qualify as a subsidy and agree like, oh, well, someday we'll just all swear them off equally?
I wish that'd be the dream. Because they're self-interested and benefit from these subsidies. I worry that that's never going to be the case, and the IRA is the latest example of that. But um, it's frustrating to me when a lot of these industries say that they are cost competitive without subsidies, and then we tack on 10 more years of a production tax credit or an investment tax credit. And to be fair, I mean that's I think why nuclear was clamoring for a tax credit to keep the existing fleet operating, and because they were competing with subsidized renewables, and if some of those projects can bid negatively into the grid, it's less power that they can sell to the grid, and it starts to become uneconomical. And so I wish we could get to a policy place where we could remove all subsidies for all energy technologies. And to your point, they come in a wide range of forms. It's not just the tax credits. There's loan guarantees. There's insurance subsidies that the nuclear industry benefits from. And the offshore oil industry benefits from too. And so there is just a wide range of government preferences that exist in the marketplace today. And I truly believe that, again, that nuclear can survive without these subsidies. I think part of the challenge is one, getting rid of subsidies for all the energy sources, but also understanding that when you have these subsidies, it does reduce the incentive to become cost competitive in a world without subsidies and rather spend more time politicking to get extensions of these subsidies. And so you've seen areas in which the private sector has driven costs down for nuclear power. When natural gas got very cheap and it was much cheaper to build and operate a natural gas plant as a result of fracking technologies, you've seen tremendous investments from the nuclear energy industry to drive down costs and be competitive. And I think that's ultimately what we want to see, at least at C3 Solutions, is we love nuclear, but we are not saying we need to mandatorily build nuclear power plants or it's the way of the future. For us, that's for the market to determine. And the best way for the market to determine that and understand that energy is an input for everything we do and produce. So we want the lowest cost power and reliability at the forefront is to let the market determine that.
Well, yeah, speaking of that, so you sort of alluded to earlier some of the market participants that are driving enthusiasm for this, especially new small modular reactor technology, the specifically the big tech companies, so Microsoft and Google, Alphabet, and others have been rolling out plans and hard deals with hard numbers on them, energy purchase guarantees, saying we want, one, we have a need for huge new data centers to run things like artificial intelligence, AI applications, and that's going to expand dramatically the amount of energy we use, and especially given the companies that have already made net zero pledges, or uh, there are pledges now moving to say we will have a net zero operations by a certain day, 2030, 2040, 2050, but also that we will somehow zero out all of the emissions we've ever made ever in the history of our company,
Yeah.
which ambitious. But um, so for me, there's sort of like there's two sides of this. One side of a positive one maybe a less positive one. So one is that you have private sector people putting real money behind, putting their money where their mouth is, and saying this is a technology we can depend on. We're rolling it out, and that will create a public policy incentive to move more in that direction, right? If no one really cared about SMR rollout, then except, a few energy policy people, it might not move forward. But if the CEOs of all of our biggest tech companies are really excited about it, it's a possibility it would move along a little
Hmm.
faster. Um, but on the flip side with so that's the positive side. The flip side of that though is um, these projects seem to mostly be on-site projects, which is that we're going to build a reactor and it's going to be at a specific place and it's going to power just our technology.
Yep.
It's not going to be on the grid and it's not going to like be part of our wider network. And the reason why we don't want to invest in a reactor that's going to be part of the grid is because updating the grid is an insane nightmare that takes 20 years and hundreds of millions of dollars to do. That it's way more complicated and expensive than it should be. We can't build the transmission lines; they can't be permitted. Building something across state lines again, it's like the XL pipeline. It's like impossible.
Hmm. Yep.
So we're not even going to try to make our national grid better and more reliable. This trillion-dollar company is just going to buy its own nuclear power and have it, you know, power its own servers, and that's it. Isn't that kind of a defeat?
Yeah, I think in a lot of senses it is. I think if there's a case to be made that it can help maybe drive down the cost of these technologies, and then they may later get integrated into the grid, and we actually fix some of our permitting problems, then like yes, that's the wishful thinking of this. But again, to me, it's almost like how you treat a categorical exclusion to the National Environmental Policy Act. Like, yeah, maybe it's like a small marginal win because we're going to build X technology faster. And it's great that, geothermal is now on par with oil and gas on federal lands because they just got a Cat X. But we can't just Cat X for the technologies and companies that we like and want to, give special treatment for them, even though it's a more efficient process, and that's a win. We need to do that for everything, and ultimately bearing in mind that we have consumers to care about, and if there's going to be energy demand kind of writ large that we need to be thinking about, and we need to make improvements and have more energy supply going forward. And so therefore, if it's policies that just grant special privileges or categorical exclusions or favoritism toward these large industrial consumers to for them to get the power that they need while casting the ratepayers to the side, that becomes problematic if we're worried about higher costs for ratepayers and consumers and worried about the reliability of the grid moving forward. So I hope that this isn't the case, but I'm wondering if this is it's going to get bad before it gets better. That if there is more challenges with the grid in terms of reliability and prices, start to really escalate to a point where consumers are already frustrated by elevated levels of inflation for some time. If electricity rates get higher, if we see rolling brownouts in some areas of the country that just were, we always just thought that was kind of isolated to California, then it may be imperative to actually fix some of the other outstanding issues that really need to be consumer centric in mind, not just helping the Amazons and Googles and Alphabets of the world.
Well, yeah, I noticed because this seems to be a wider scale issue with sort of overregulation in general, even including some seemingly unrelated things like building housing in some of our big cities, like maybe San Francisco, for example, where instead of saying to someone who has a project, well, as long as you're not going to light anyone's house on fire or kill anyone, as long as you're going to be doing stuff basically safely, you can build what you need to build on your land, or you can build the facility you need to build, you can connect it to what you need to connect it to. It seems like we have an overall system where it's almost impossible to do anything under the rules as they exist. So only it's only possible unless if you have a project that has discretionary review and gets exceptions, right?
Right.
Even if they're not subsidies, you have to be exempted from 7 of the 12 rules before your project will even pencil out. And that seems like a backwards way of doing things.
It does. And yeah, there's countless examples in the energy world that we've seen that didn't fall under those criteria, and therefore we didn't get the necessary infrastructure in place. I mean, you brought up Keystone XL. I think we're seeing more kind of keystoneization of energy and linear infrastructure, and now the folks who are worried about transmission policy are recognizing that that is a big challenge. But I mean, Keystone XL is a good example where we've had this policy of a national interest determination. And during the Obama administration's review, their environmental impact statement, the State Department concluded that the pipeline wasn't going to have any meaningful impact on GHG emissions because the oil from Canada was going to come out of the ground anyway. And so we should be shipping it by pipeline rather than rail because it's more environmentally efficient to do so. And yet they still denied the State Department denied the presidential permit for the pipeline, citing environmental concerns. And here we are, 16 years later without a pipeline. And that's only gotten worse in those 16 years and spread across different types of energy infrastructure projects, whether it's been for renewables or natural gas, more recently LNG with the pause that the Biden administration put in place. And so, yeah, I worry that our supply isn't going to keep up with the demand until it reaches semi-crisis mode.
Right. So the question is where how will that unfold politically? And you mentioned prices, people concerned about inflation, and everyone's always concerned about gas prices, right? It was a
Mm-hmm.
couple summers
Mm-hmm.
ago, the White House was in a sort of panic mode because gas prices had spiked up, and that's something people notice. Um, so, I wonder if you think there's going to be some sort of realignment here on energy policy, because the dumb version is that the the Democratic Party is the more environmental party and they care about this stuff more, so they're going to be uh more sort of aligned with the environmental movement, climate justice side of the scale, and Republicans care more
Mm-hmm.
about like economic growth and stuff and energy independence, and so they're going to be more on that side of it. Uh, but as we've been talking, something like, permitting reform for nuclear power, one, it's cleaner, and two, it's also, you know, a, an energy independence move, right? Because we're not
Absolutely.
we're not
Yep.
we're not importing nuclear power plants from overseas. So, is it what are the prospects, do you think, for the at least some of Party A and some of Party B coming together to say, let's get this done?
I'm hopeful, and I mean, you've even had, kind of some strange bedfellows already come together, even just in this past year with the Advance Act that was supposed to help, um, again with some licensing and permitting issues, with some international cooperation, and that was largely bipartisan, largely non-controversial piece of legislation. I think the question is really how far does that piece of legislation, now law, move the needle? I think it's going to help on net for sure. But again, given the outstanding issues that we've touched on in this discussion so far, I think Congress needs to be a lot bolder in the reforms to help nuclear flourish in the United States and drive down the costs of building and operating a nuclear power plant. And I'm hoping this is just the first of many bipartisan attempts, not just saying, we're going to like wipe our sleeves and be done with nuclear policy moving forward, because there's so much more to be done. And so I am cautiously optimistic that this is one of those areas of bipartisan support. But given some of the frustrations, I think that we've seen in the public policy space with nuclear power, spent fuel management being one of them. Again, some of the regulations and the permitting being another. That we're starting to get there, but we just need to go a lot further.
All right, that's that is a uh, a great way to look at it. We do need to go a lot further. You will be a cautious optimist. I will be like my old friend and colleague Fred Smith, a despairing optimist. But we can stay optimistic.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Nick. This was an excellent discussion. And before we go, tell us, where can people find you and all your work online?
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me. I enjoyed the podcast and enjoyed the discussion. We are at c3solutions.org. We also have our own online news magazine called c3newsmag.com, where we talk about a lot of public policy issues, what's happening in the energy space, the innovations that the private sector is making. And so please check us out there as well.
All right. Thanks again for being with us, Nick.
Thank you. Take care.